And our world leaders have been reacting to the arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by the military of the United States. The Russian Foreign Ministry has condemned the U.S. action, describing it as an act of armed aggression against Venezuela. The Russian Foreign Ministry condemned the U.S. action and saying that describing it as an arm of aggression against Venezuela, while embracing the statement by the Venezuelan authorities and the leaders of Latin American countries calling for an immediate meeting of the UN Security Council. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, on his part, says he would establish the facts first and speak to President Trump before making formal comment. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in a statement, expressed deep alarm about the escalation in Venezuela, including potential breaches of international law.
Fast-moving situation, and we need to establish all the facts. What I can say is that the UK was not involved in any way in this operation, and as you'd expect, we're focusing on British nationals in Venezuela and working very closely with our embassy. And so I will want to talk to the President, I will want to talk to allies, but at the moment I think we need to establish the facts. I think President Trump is doing a press conference later, so hopefully more information will come out then.
And to discuss more on these stories, we are now being joined by Dr. Laskiewicz, who joins us from London. Thank you for your time, Dr. Marek. When you listen to the statement of the speech, I mean, the president did say that the American were going to take over the, Venezuela for now until proper transition occur. Speak to us. What do you make of this statement and the speech? I guess you're following this development.
It's a very worrying and troublesome development for several reasons. It would appear, prima facie, to be a breach of international law. It's not clear what President Donald Trump is going to achieve by this, because after all, it wasn't just the president and his wife who are carrying out actions which he doesn't like. How on earth he's going to run Venezuela is unclear. The implication is, of course, that Venezuela is a colony of America until the Americans feel that they can hand over power to somebody or other. And he's made it quite clear he wants to see a regime change. Well, the troublesome aspect of this is if he does not succeed in running the country, then he's in a Vietnam. Because to be quite honest, he's put a lot of prestige on the line making that comment. And if he can't run the country, it's going to look bad. Moreover, there is the other aspect of all this, is that here we are condemning President Putin for his invasion of Ukraine, and it's very hard to see exactly why the invasion of Venezuela is all that much better.
I mean, speak to us about, well, because when we look at this development, especially you spoke about the fact that the same thing they have condemned Putin for, that's exactly what we're seeing. Let's look at what this portends for the global south entirely.
Well, the implication is, of course, quite worrying. The implication is that America can invade any Latin American country it doesn't like the government of, or doesn't like what the government is doing. I mean, that is the implication. Already, several of the missilings of Venezuelan boats were very questionable, since after there was no trial, there was no actual proof of guilt of any sort. It was just that the Americans felt that these were bad and had to be taken out. The implication here is that America can do what it's like in Latin America. And that, of course, is something the Latin Americans have accused America of for many decades now, with the CIA being implicated in coups here and there in Central and South America. And so here is the key problem. What on earth are we to make of international rights right now for any Latin American country?
Let's look at the legal justification, and the conversations around sovereignty. The Trump administration, points to a long-standing indictment accusing Maduro of narco-terrorism from a legal standpoint. Does that provide sufficient justification for, for these? Calling for, a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. I mean, some people have said that.
Well, precisely. The problem is that actually Venezuela is not subject to American law. If America had conquered Venezuela and Venezuela is a colony of America, then in that case, of course, it's entirely different. American law applies, and you could have arrested somebody like President Maduro without a problem. But he's not. He's in Venezuela, and in principle, this is a sovereign nation. Either sovereignty is being upheld, and of course, the key question here is Ukraine, or it's basically the world seems to be being cut up here between the triumvirate of Russia wanting basically Ukraine, and of course not just Ukraine, as I've said in my books, Poland is probably next on the list. China wants Taiwan, and here's America going into Venezuela. If America can go into Venezuela, why can't China invade Taiwan? It's the same logic.
Interesting. Well, that's also a case of indictment dating back 2020. I mean, is this about enforcing U.S. law, or is this a regime change operation dressed in a legal language, if I may put it that way? Because some people have asked this question, why act now? What do you think has changed, really?
Yeah, interesting question. The key point is why act now? And as far as I can tell, it is linked to the fact that Trump is showing, if you like, his strength. This is a good moment to show it because the situation in Gaza, especially within phase 2, is questionable. Hamas is not disarming and Israel is carrying an attack in Gaza. And also, Putin is more or less thumbing his nose at whatever Trump's doing with Zelensky. And I think from that point of view, it's as if Trump wants to show that he's still a big man. America is very powerful. And I think that's the reason for the timing. As for the legalese of it, since Venezuela is not subject to American law, none of this legalese works. By the same token, you might argue that, I don't know, another country, Germany might have some quarrel with, say, Venezuela, but that's not reason for an invasion. So the point about it is the international law is bound with sovereignty. If Venezuela says that, in its opinion, in its law courts, that the president was guilty of crimes in America, then there's a process for this, yes, extradition. And that's the correct legal process. Either that, or it is a world of the jungle, where America decides who runs what in Latin America.
Let's step back a bit from the military and the political noise around this development. Perhaps the big question tonight is to look at whether Venezuelans are better off or happy. Do we know how Venezuelans, feel tonight? Whether it is a relief, celebration, or uncertainty? How would you describe that?
As far as I can tell, you've got to split Venezuela into two. There are the people who support the regime, and they are very distressed and already talking about the martyrs who died. And they're basically now regrouping to make sure America can't run Venezuela, whatever President Donald Trump thinks. That's as far as I can tell it on that front. As for the average person in Venezuela, the fact of the matter is Venezuela is a very tightly run country by this regime, and the citizens have very little to say about it. The recent elections were questionable, to say the least, and as a result, I would argue that whatever the populace thinks is not actually going to be of that importance immediately. It's how this regime reacts, because the population is basically disarmed and incapable of resistance as things stand. So the question is, what precisely will Trump do to run the country? If he can't answer this question, and that's what I meant by saying before in my talk it was troublesome, if he can't answer it, then he's actually in for type of Vietnam, where he's trying to impose his will, and many people oppose it there locally. So that is now the key question. What will he do next?
What will he do next? That's the key question. I mean, also following up on his speech earlier, he said he was going to, of course, take over governance in Venezuela until transition occurs. And we also saw the opposition leader, Machado, that's talking about Maria Machado, also commenting on this development, describing it as a time for freedom for Venezuelans. But given Machado's own absence from the country, does the opposition realistically have the structure really to govern immediately? I do know that Trump said they were going to take over, but how that will happen, nobody knows yet.
Precisely, we have no idea what his next move is, and that's what I was indicating. As for the opposition, it is basically smashed. The Venezuelan regime has a monopoly of power, and there is no viable opposition which can quickly tomorrow take power. So this implies, and this is of course would be in agreement with what President Trump said, it'll take some time for it to be able to run the country, hence the time for this judicious transition. And so therefore, the comments by the opposition, of course, will be welcome for President Donald Trump, but they're not strong enough, the opposition, to actually make a huge difference. It hinges on what the regime and how it will react to its president being, arrested, kidnapped, however you care to put it. The key point here is President Maduro absolutely irreplaceable? If he is not, then I'm afraid the Americans are in for a bad time, because they can't run a country like Venezuela easily. You could, in terms of military interventions, what he's saying, of course, there is a further disturbing aspect to this. Recently, there's this business of President Donald Trump saying that things are not to his liking in Nigeria. So are we to expect an invasion there? Once he has crossed this line of making invasions, where precisely is he going to stop? Greenland, Canada, Nigeria?
Okay. As we wind down now, Dr. Marek, let's also look at reactions from around the world. We saw Russia, Iran, Cuba, and Colombia, reacting and condemning this in strong terms. Specifically, Colombia is calling for an emergency UN Security Council meeting. How far can they go with this call as a wrap-up now?
Yes, they can certainly press for a UN meeting on this point. But the key point is the people who haven't commented. President Zelensky stayed quiet. Keir Starmer spoke for 5 minutes but said nothing. In other words, what is missing is that anybody coming out on America's side. There's no one. Because many people are dubious, as indeed I've indicated, about the international legal aspects. As for his enemies, or people who have got can make use of this, because President Putin is simply making use of this, it's been a godsend to them. And so therefore the key point is, yes, there probably will be some UN talks, and yes, there might be some sort of meetings. But the interesting aspect is no one's come out in support of President Trump. That's another worrying feature. Please remember, in Vietnam, America fought alone, and that was one of the troublesome aspects of Vietnam. And this is what's threatening to be the case here in Venezuela.
Author and international analyst, and affairs analyst, thank you so much, Dr. Marek, speaking to us from London.